All right, class, so we've just come through the really brutal, violent story of primitive accumulation. Now we're at chapter 32, which is Marx's powerful summary of the entire historical arc of capitalism. He's moving from its origins, its genesis, to what he calls its historical tendency. In other words, where is this all headed?
So let's really dive into this. The core question of this chapter is this. Once the capitalist system is up and running, what are the built-in internal laws that push it forward and shape its final outcome? And for Marx, this isn't about a moral judgment. He sees it as the necessary, logical result of the system's own rules of the game.
Okay, to really get a handle on where Marx thinks this is all going, we have to first establish the starting point. We need to understand the world that capitalism had to destroy in order to come into being. We need to understand what came before so we can understand the negation that followed.
So picture this. It's the world of the independent peasant who owns their own plot of land, or the artisan who owns their own tools. This is a world of small-scale scattered production. And the fundamental principle here is the fusion of labor and property. Put simply, the person doing the work owns the stuff they need to do that work. Now, Marx argues this was a necessary step, but it could only take society so far.
And that brings us to what Marx calls the first negation. This is the first big act in the historical drama. The move from that world of individual property to capitalist property wasn't some peaceful, gradual change. As we've seen, it was a violent, brutal process of separation.
And this is where you see this fundamental flip, a complete inversion of how property works. Capitalist private property isn't based on the owner's own work anymore. No, it's based on their power to command the labor of other people, people who have been stripped of their own means of production. So you get this complete divorce. The producer is separated from property, and property is separated from labor.
And this process, this path is, well, it's exactly what we've been talking about, right? This is the story of primitive accumulation. This forceful expropriation of the many by the few is what Marx calls the first negation. It negates that old world of individual property. And with that, the stage is set for the system's own internal logic to really take over.
So once it's established, capitalism never just stands still. It has these relentless internal laws, and internal is the key word. It's not like there are outside forces pushing it. The logic is baked right into the system itself, and these laws inevitably drive it toward a point of crisis.
You could call this the brutal law of competition. Just to survive, every capitalist is forced to accumulate more and more capital. It's an eat or be eaten world. And Marx says this accumulation process really happens in two key ways, and it's absolutely crucial that we understand the difference between them.
First up is concentration. Think of this as internal growth. A successful capitalist takes their profits, the surplus value, and they plow it right back into the business. They buy more machinery, more raw materials, they hire more workers. Their individual pile of capital just gets bigger and bigger.
Centralization, on the other hand, is a different beast entirely. This isn't about making more wealth, it's about changing who holds the wealth that already exists. This is where the bigger fish swallow the smaller ones. Through ruthless competition, hostile takeovers, and the whole credit system, the stronger capitalists absorb or just crush their rivals. And the result is that vast amounts of wealth get centralized into fewer and fewer hands.
And all of this leads to what Marx sees as the absolute central contradiction of capitalism. See, on one hand, the way we produce things becomes more and more social. You have thousands of workers cooperating in huge factories, science being used systematically, a global market that connects all of us. Production is a massive collective effort. But, on the other hand, the ownership and the control over all of this incredible social power becomes concentrated in the hands of an ever-shrinking group of capitalists.
So, something has to give, right? This tension can't just build forever. And that brings us to the dialectical climax of Marx's whole historical argument. This massive contradiction between social production and private ownership has to, in his view, eventually resolve itself.
This is the turning point. The very mechanisms that made capitalism so incredibly productive, concentration and centralization, eventually become chains. They become a fetter. The sheer scale of social production starts to clash with the narrow limits of private ownership. The system that unleashed all this productive power now starts to hold it back.
For Marx, this is the moment the system's own logic turns on itself. The system that negated the old form of property is now itself negated. He argues that the working class, which capitalism itself created, organized, and disciplined in its factories, rises up. The outer shell of private property is burst open.
Now, this idea, the negation of the negation, is absolutely critical, and it can be a little tricky, so let's break it down. This is not about just hitting the rewind button and going back to the way things were. The second negation doesn't just undo the first one, it moves beyond it. It keeps the achievements of capitalism, but it puts them on a totally new foundation.
So let's be crystal clear about what this isn't. Marx is not saying we're all going to go back to being small-time peasants and artisans with our own little workshops. That would be a huge step backwards. Instead, he's arguing for a new kind of property that keeps the social cooperative production that capitalism created, but puts it under collective social ownership.
So if we map this whole thing out, you can really see the dialectical logic at play. You start with the thesis, that world of scattered individual property. That's negated by its opposite, the antithesis, concentrated capitalist property. But then, that antithesis develops its own internal problems, its own contradictions, which leads to its own negation, a new synthesis that combines social production with social ownership.
Now, Marx thinks this second expropriation, taking from the few capitalists, will be a lot faster and less violent than the first one. I mean, it's the majority taking back from a tiny group of usurpers. But this all raises a really interesting question. If these are the internal laws of the system, does capital just sit back and wait for it to happen? Or does it try to find ways to manage or even exploit its own contradictions to delay the inevitable? And that sets us up perfectly for our final chapter, but we'll look at the theory of colonization as one of capital's greatest escape attempts.